Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. So glad that you're here today for this Non-Degree Credentials Research Network webinar. My name is Michelle Vanoy. I'm Director of the Education and Employment Research Center and co-PI on the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network, along with Kyle Alpert, who's usually here, but is unable to be with us today. He's traveling, but I'm really excited to be here and stepping in for Kyle as a moderator, and happy to introduce our panelists today. We're super excited for today's webinar to talk about developing a national qualifications framework in the United States. So folks, feel free to drop questions into the chat. We are going to have the presentation and then have a good time at the end for Q&A and for chat. Webinar is being recorded, so we'll share out that recording with folks later on. Up to you if you want to keep your camera on or off, but throughout the discussion. But we have our great speakers today, so I want to just take a moment to introduce Todd Lee Goen from the USQF Board of Directors. He's the vice president there in the USQF, and Melissa Ganiere, who's the project manager there, who'll be joining us today for the webinar. She's currently the project manager of the US Qualifications Framework, and as I said, Todd is the interim vice president of the Board of Directors. And today they're going to be discussing the development of the National Qualifications Framework in the US. The USQF is a newly established nonprofit in DC whose mission is to establish a functioning credentials framework in the United States. So today we're going to hope to learn about the progress that's been made in this initiative and what's still happening, what's still required going forth. And we're really excited to hear about sort of how non-degree credentials are going to fit within this framework. So without further ado on my part, I'll turn things over to Todd to share this work with us.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, I hope that I'm now sharing my presentation with everyone. Can I get a thumbs up if folks can see it? Yes, wonderful. All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today to talk to you about the USQF. The title of this presentation really comes from the idea that if you look around the world, you'll find that a number of countries, around 150 of them, have an NQF, a National Qualifications Framework, either already established or in progress. And so we're looking at how we develop something similar for the United States. And what we're really going to be talking about today are NQFs, how they function, what sort of they are, and how we might use them in the US, as well as the current status of the USQF project, and then some ways in which you could support or be involved in that project. But I want to start with a little bit of an overview of what an NQF is. Some of you may be very familiar with this. This may be new to some of you as well. But what we're really talking about here is a national framework that help us educate people about education. And when we use the term education here, we're using it in the broadest possible sense. We're not just talking about the traditional formal education models that we have in the United States, which is what we typically think of when we think of education. And the way that these tend to work is that they describe the levels of outcomes that people have with regards to sort of education in terms of outcomes, learning outcomes. So there's less confusion then around specific credentials or qualifications per se, because we know that individuals have achieved a particular level of outcome in the work that they are doing or in their training or learning. We also have to think about these in terms of the idea of transferability. So what does it mean for an individual to have a particular level of qualification? And how do we then convey that across different types of learning? So one of the questions that we might think about is if someone has, for example, gone through a non-commissioned military route, and they have training in nuclear energy, and they are getting out of the military and now decide that they want to go pursue some higher education. They have all of this nuclear training. How does that relate to, let's say, a nuclear engineering program? How do we award sort of outcomes or competency or credit or equivalency, and what does that look like? So that transferability piece becomes really important. The other piece that we talk about here is something called fluidity, and the idea that over the course of life, we need to be able to develop skills, and we need to be able to retool in various ways or grow and deepen our learning and understanding. And so a framework such as this also supports that fluidity of accessibility and additional learning opportunities across the course of an individual's life. So how is it that we then begin to use these NQFs? Well, we have to think here about the ways in which they can be used both domestically and internationally. And what they're really designed to do is primarily give us a sense of domestically, how are qualifications known or valued in the context of a society? But then internationally, how do we compare qualifications from one society to another in the context of that system? So how is it that we fit a particular qualification or skill into a system? For example, in the United States, a lot of our degree programs that we have, our professional degree programs, don't have similar equivalencies in foreign countries, or the equivalency is not something that we would recognize in the US. For example, I think about law, which for us is a professional doctoral program, but in most countries isn't a doctoral program at all, but rather an undergraduate focused degree program. And then how do we begin to think beyond just degree programs, and how do we begin to look at non-degree oriented education and learning as a part of that process? So really what we're trying to do is to help everyone who is in any way connected to learning, whether that be through workforce development, whether that be through education, whether that be through any sort of system that's out there, be able to understand the skills and abilities that individuals have and talk about those across different arenas. And that really describes then the goal is, how do these qualifications fit together in relationship to each other? And so that's really what we're working toward when we think about the particular focus that we have, which is the US National Qualifications Framework, or the USQF. Okay, so as we move forward in thinking about sort of goal-oriented work, one of the things that we have to think about is, what particular problem does work like this solve? So if we think about sort of where we are and how we've gotten here, oftentimes the question becomes, well, why do we need an NQF? And certainly, why do we need an NQF now? And the real reason that we would argue that we need this is really four different reasons. And the first is that there needs to be better transparency for what it means to have a particular level of learning in the context of US society. How do we evaluate that? We're seeing a push right now for more apprenticeship programs. We're seeing a greater interest in those particular types of programs as a part of the sort of focus as we move forward. Then we also have to think about transparency. How does that fit within other contexts and societies? We think about comparability. Comparability in terms of what are equivalencies in terms of degrees. How do we compare this thing that we might say is an apple to this other thing that might be an orange? But if both are really about learning, what is the level of learning that's occurring here? And how do we begin to address those particular components or values or ideas about this? And portability, then, how do we begin to shift these things over the course of systems, or think about how we compare credentials from one type of learning to another type of learning, or how do we compare them across institutions or even across countries? And finally, we will add that if you engage in this from a learning perspective, you also are looking at sort of the quality assurance component of the process. So how do we think about ensuring that the learning that's occurring in one particular context is equivalent to the learning that's occurring in another context? And we think about that in terms of outcomes. What level of outcome do we need, and how do we begin to evaluate those particular viewpoints or perspectives as a part of that process? So when we think about sort of where we are, I and a number of others in the discussion of this have sort of said, the US is sort of at a critical juncture in thinking about what education means. If you look politically, there are a number of questions about the value of certain types of education, pushes for one type of education over another type of education. So what does learning look like and what are the outcomes associated with that? And we have particular values that we attach to a variety of different educational pursuits in the context of our society. And should we really begin to think differently about that? And what does that look like? And how do we begin to have some of those arguments or have some of those discussions within the context of our society? So we think this is a really important time for thinking about NQF specifically in the context of the United States. So thinking about the problems that it solves, we also then want to think about what it actually provides us. So what do we get out of an NQF? I think the first and foremost, the thing that we get is a better understanding of qualifications across different types of learning. One of the things that, one of the points that I made at the USQF symposium over the summer is when we think about learning and we think about credentials and we think about qualifications, the woman who cuts my hair has a particular level of learning. She has a particular set of qualifications, and yet those are not necessarily qualifications or abilities that are viewed as equivalent to other types of skills or learning. And yet at the same time, she is in a position to have information and skills that I don't have. And how do we begin to then measure that or talk about that or say, okay, what is the difference between someone who is a beginning hairstylist or hairdresser and someone who is at the top of their field? And how do we make those particular levels of distinction? We can do that in certain fields and industries, and we may not have the same abilities in others. And an NQF provides that to us. The other thing that it does is that it gives us an articulation or a system of progressing learning. What does learning look like over the course of one's career or professional experience or professional expertise? Historically, when we've thought about learning or, excuse me, education in the United States, we've done so through the framework or through the lens of formal education. But that doesn't exist for every field or every industry. Sometimes it's much more formal, or maybe it's formalized in a non-academic setting. I think about, I mentioned earlier, apprenticeship programs. Those are quite common throughout many places in the world. We see them in the US as well in certain industries. How do we then begin to articulate what it means to progress through the various stages of those levels of training or learning as well? In addition, an NQF gives us a sense or an ability to begin to think about, not just from a learning perspective, but from an employment perspective, how can employers begin to understand the different levels or expectations for outcomes based on different types of learning and growth? And that could largely lead to a much more open recruitment process where we're talking about different ideas or different frameworks for understanding how education will function or how learning will function in the context of society. I was chatting recently with some folks who are working in another country that has a very well-developed NQF. And instead of talking about pursuing a particular degree at the university, one of the things that they had noticed amongst the young people in that country is that they had begun to talk about, I'm pursuing this level of learning. So it's not degree-based, but rather it's level-based. And that means that employers then can talk about the skills or the outcomes that they need for a particular position based on a particular level of learning for that field. The other thing, one of the other things that you can get as a part of this process is thinking about progressions of pathways, but not just in sort of the traditional way that we think about it, with alternatives for other learners' considerations. So if you think about how someone who has a particular level of skill or experience might walk into a new role or a new industry, and how do we begin to say, oh, you have this particular level of skill and ability based on your previous work in an industry. What does that mean for you in terms of entering this particular field or industry and the alternatives that might exist there, in terms of qualifications, in terms of training, in terms of growth. Finally, it gives us an ability to say for a particular level of the NQF, we have a particular set of attributes or outcomes that we can expect someone who has that level of learning to possess in terms of an employment state, or to possess in terms of a contribution that they would make to a particular industry or a particular society. And the reason that we think that, one of the reasons that we think it's really important for the US to consider moving toward some sort of qualifications framework at the national level is because so many other countries have made this move, and those qualification frameworks are beginning now to be evaluated against each other, so that you can sort of see, based on learning and levels, where are people in the context of a particular industry. Europe is probably the most advanced in thinking through what this will look like. If you know anything about NQFs, the European Union is starting to look at sort of a European framework for this as well. So you've got the national level, but you're also beginning to see sort of regional levels of NQFs emerge in some capacity. And so we could take a look at, for example, Ireland's NQF, which you're probably not going to be able to see really well on this particular screen, but if you just Google Ireland NQF, you can easily get this image, and it will show you that they have 10 levels of learning that are associated with their national framework of qualifications. And so what does that mean for different fields and different industries? You can sort of figure that out based on the field or industry as you walk through those. But this gives us a sense of, okay, if you've got someone in the US who's looking for a job in Europe, or you've got someone who is in Europe who is moving to the US and potentially entering the US market share, how do we begin to evaluate these particular types of sort of skills and experiences as we move forward? Now, you will note that I said there are roughly 150 countries that have some sort of NQF. Ireland is one that's being heralded as quite good by most of the folks who are operating in this space. There are some that are very much still in development, and there are some that, if you were to take a look at them, they're probably not all that useful because they're so detailed, or in a couple of cases, they have so many different levels that they're not really providing good distinctions. At the same time, you're seeing general moves toward some sort of qualification framework as we move into a more global society. I would also say that one of the things that I think the West is going to have to really think through is, if you think about the future and if you think about worker shortages in industries and where people fit or don't fit, we're starting to see some really serious challenges with thinking of qualifications solely at the national level. As we think, for example, about healthcare, what is the ability of individuals who have a healthcare qualification in one country to go to another country and work in that healthcare industry? And it really is a case-by-case basis in a lot of circumstances, in terms of, oh, if you were educated at this level in this country, we would consider that qualification or framework, but we wouldn't allow that in country X or country Y. As we think about the United States and we think about where we're headed in terms of the need for healthcare workers, we've got particular industries and sectors all across the United States that need additional employers or employees that are working in those industries. And if you look at our population in the United States, we're not necessarily going to be producing the number of people within the borders of our country to be able to fill all of those positions. How do we begin to sort of move beyond that in thinking about national borders, international borders, and the movement of people to fill particular industries? So how could we use it in the United States? 4 key ways in which right now the USQF team is thinking about how this would be useful to us. The first is for credential and evaluation purposes. And I would say, if we think about the credential and evaluation work that occurs in the United States at this particular point, it's a relatively robust industry in a variety of different ways. But what is the equivalent of a law degree from one country or another country? What is the equivalent of plumbing is a plumber qualified in one country, able to come into another country, into the US and work. How do we begin to evaluate what meets standards as we begin to think about employment sectors and as we begin to move forward? It also would be a really good system in terms of a comparator. How do we compare different types of learning in the context of the US? And we're not quite there yet in terms of the way in which we think about different industries and different sectors as being comparable, but a qualifications framework gives us the ability to do that. Certainly gives us the ability to reference against other NQFs, and I think that's a critical piece of this particular puzzle, especially as we start thinking about increased global mobility and we start thinking about needs for employment in particular sectors and the need to sort of outsource some of that or insource, depending upon how you're looking at it. And then finally, I would say, and this has been a huge part of the discussion on the USQF team, is that we are at a point in the United States where we are beginning to see increased value, or beginning to talk a little bit about increased value for non-degree oriented learning, which I think is of interest to probably everyone who's participating in this particular webinar today. One of the things that this helps do is to give us a sense of where does non-degree learning fit within the hierarchy of learning that exists. How do we begin to talk about non-degree learning as pivotal to the way in which folks operate in our society? We've seen a particular increase in micro-credentialing, in badging, in those particular types of attainment. How does that fit within a greater learning framework? What does that mean for individuals who are seeking employment in some particular type of capacity? And how do we begin to talk about that? I was chatting this morning with someone who was sort of thinking through the higher education space and asking some particular questions. And historically, and I say historically, for at least the past couple of decades in the United States, we have very much operated from a mindset of the role of high school, the role of secondary education is to prepare people for tertiary education, prepare them to go to college, and that everyone should go to college. And that's largely been a bipartisan issue in the context of US society. But now we're beginning to see some pushback to say that's probably not the approach we should be taking. We should be thinking about different ways of learning, and not everyone is designed for college, and are other positions out there that are requiring college degrees that shouldn't be. How do we begin to track apprenticeship learning? How do we begin to track internship experiences? How do we begin to track individuals who are working in industries that don't have some sort of formalized mechanism for evaluating or tracking or licensing experts or professionals in that area? And so that's a huge, particularly important piece of this puzzle that needs to be addressed as we think about how we move forward in conversations related to learning and qualifications and credentialing. So let's think about where we are currently in this process. So what's happened to date, and we're about 3 years into this process with the USQF, is that we've established a nonprofit headquartered in Washington, D.C., and it currently has an interim board of directors that is overseeing it. That interim board of directors has met. For the first time in July, we have approved bylaws. And then in addition to that, we have an active advisory council that is largely working on the framework process, that is largely working on the all of the different elements in terms of communications and marketing and all of the things that we need to be able to get this particular effort off.
Puhua mitään tää jenkkien.
Sorry, trying to mute folks. Trying to get this particular effort off the ground. So there's been a significant amount of work that has gone through the process already, and we're looking at now how do we move forward. And so this is sort of a big piece of the puzzle in terms of getting things off the ground. We actually have the organization formed, and we've got folks who have stepped into some leadership roles to be able to say, let's propel this toward the future. So what does that actually look like in practice? So what you'll see on the screen, and I fully recognize that this will be challenging to see, we'll give you the link to what we've got, or to the website where you can go and look at this a little bit later. But we have the traditional academic credentials already mapped and described in the context of the U.S. Qualifications Framework. So we started with the academic piece and essentially have that laid out. And the reason that we started with that piece first is that there has been a lot of work that has already been done throughout that particular process to get us to where we are currently in terms of having a USQF that's laid out and sort of mapping and describing how we do formal education in the context of the US. And we also are in a position now where we are getting ready to think through the professional and vocational side of things in terms of that credentialing process. And at this particular point, what I'm going to go ahead and do is shift my portion of the presentation over to my colleague, Mel, who has joined us, and Mel is going to take it from here to continue our discussion of the actual framework.
Thanks, Todd, and apologies that I'm joining a bit late. I was having some technical issues, but it's sorted out. So I'm going to start talking about where we are currently. And as you can see there, we have the current qualifications framework on the screen that we've been developing. And you can see that this includes a lot of the traditional academic credentials already being mapped and described from some of that previous work that was started through the DQP and connecting credentials. Essentially, we're taking that work that has been started and continuing to build off of that. And you'll notice that the professional or vocational credentials might be a bit lacking. And so that's what we're looking to start doing that research to make sure those are included and incorporated in the framework. And I apologize as I'm joining late. Todd, I believe you have to advance the slides for me.
Gotcha.
Okay, and so where we are currently, we're thinking through what equivalency means. So these are the ISED definitions of an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree. I'll give you just a minute to look through those while I'm trying to access some additional information to share with you all. So the ISED levels are simple and digestible. However, they do rely on the universal language of the academic system. So the key for us then is mapping the full system across not just the theoretical, the degree, formal, classroom-based side of the system, but also across the applied side of the system, so that we're including work-based, non-formal, non-degree, or non-classroom training to flesh out the or equivalent elements of the system. So I know that for myself as an individual, when looking at a job posting or employment opportunities, I'm always curious about what or equivalent means. Do the employers know that? And as a potential job seeker, is there a way that we can define this better? So the USQF seeks to build such a system and an internationally accepted and understood standards, and to also increase equity through transparency, increase access and optionality and mobility as a result of the codification of a new professional education path. And speaking of codifying education, we're also starting to think about AI and how that relates to learning. So is or equivalent a machine readable level? And I'm not sure if that is the case or not. So moving on to think about how you can contribute. So we are still in the beginning stages of developing national qualifications in the United States. We need more policy documents surrounding the level descriptors, implementation guidelines, and referencing. So we would love to have you join us in completing some of that work. I'm aware that a lot of what is going on right now. There are complementary initiatives in the US. So Colorado, for example, or Indiana, there's a lot of work already being done in this arena. And we just want to make sure that we're all working together. As for non-degree credentials, where do those fit in within the established academic levels? In a discussion this morning that I was on with Credential Engine, we looked at the difference between competency frameworks and qualification frameworks and how those should be aligned and possibly even embedded within the United States Qualification Framework. So the differences were described as generic and specific. For example, a National Qualifications Framework will have generic level descriptors in which very specific competency levels can reside. Both of those aspects can survive independently, but they complement each other in describing a learner's journey. Another task that will be assigned to the Board of Directors is a creation of a long-term plan for the United States Qualifications Framework. So we are currently in phase 2 of this initiative, and we'll be moving into phase 3 once the permanent board is established. Their first task will be developing a 5 to 10-year vision for the USQF. And I'm sure that Todd mentioned where we are currently with the establishment of the 501c3 and the interim board of directors. I just want to say that there's a lot of this work happening internationally already. We want to ensure that the US isn't missing from these conversations. So we need a functioning framework that we can map our qualifications and credentials to other NQFs and even some of those RQFs, the regional qualifications frameworks that are being developed. As you know, with the work that Credential Engine is doing and their credential registry, we're looking to incorporate the qualifications framework into that registry. They were part of the founding agency of the USQF Advisory Council. And then we were also, as I'm sure Todd mentioned, very careful to include a very diverse stakeholder board and body when implementing the USQF. And then now that the permanent call for the board of directors is active, we're hoping that many of you will consider joining that initiative. So that leads me to the next slide, which is how you might consider contributing. One of the challenges you might have noticed as we've been speaking on this topic or in your own work in this arena is the vast amount of qualifications that are available to learners in the United States. So recently during a meeting with the Scottish Credits and Qualifications Framework, or the SCQF, they are an established NQF that's been around for about 20 years. They mentioned that a privilege of their NQF was that they could physically gather the registrars of every single higher education institution into one room in Scotland. So I'm not sure if that would ever be possible in the United States, maybe if we gathered in a football stadium somewhere. But we're just looking at a very large task. But I believe that with the right individuals and stakeholders and support, we can bring it to completion. Another challenge that we're facing is funding for the NQF. Many of the initiatives and the work that's done in developing additional qualification frameworks around the world are funded by governments or supported by the European Union entities. But we feel that the USQF should be managed domestically. And as such, we need domestic donors to join in the USQF. So again, the board of directors will have a committee devoted to this, but as it currently stands, both the advisory council and the board of directors are 100% volunteer. But some of the other ways to contribute to the USQF is just increasing the visibility of it. We know that there's a lot of initiatives happening congruently right now, and our desire is to get all of those initiatives kind of in the same space and collaborating and working collectively. We also want to be engaging with the state level credential initiatives. So again, I mentioned Colorado and Indiana. Wisconsin is working within sort of the apprenticeship work force space as well. So we want to make sure that we're communicating with those stakeholders. And then finally, just the governance. I'm not sure, Todd, if you got to speak much about the board of directors call that is happening. Okay, so currently, and I know some of you have been identified and might have already received an invitation, but as part of the establishment of the USQF, Phase 1 was initiated in May of 2022. So that was our first advisory council meeting. From there, we developed the charter, and that was established. So we worked on Phase 1, which was basically the development of the matrix, the gathering of stakeholders, and just the raising awareness and interest for the USQF. That completed in May of 2023, at which point we started Phase 2 of the USQF, and that was to establish as a nonprofit, which was done in March of 2003, at which point then we had our inaugural symposium in DC in July, and that was in conjunction with the first board of directors meeting. The next step is to establish the permanent board of directors. So as you saw, we have an interim board at the moment. September 30th is the close of that call where we are recruiting for the permanent board of directors. That board will then step in and establish Phase 3 of the USQF, which will work at a longer term plan of 5 to 10 years that will cover more of the maintenance and the governance of the USQF as an independent entity. So if you are interested in learning more about serving on that board or learning more about what the USQF is up to, what progress we're making, how you can be a part of it, I really encourage you to just reach out on the website. It's there, www.usqf.org. You can also reach out to Todd or myself personally. We'd be happy to answer any questions. And we really do want to learn about the work that's happening within NCRN and some of these other initiatives and how we can play a role in that and how we can work together to complement each other. So we're going to open it up now, Michelle, if there are any questions. I'm not sure if the chat is the best way to go about that, but Todd, I'll also hand it back over to you.
I've been watching the chat. There's been a few questions that have come in. So I don't know if we'd like to maybe start with one of the questions from the chat.
Sure.
So Lenora, I don't know would you like to vocalize your question or would you like me to read? If you want to. There was a question here for efforts to develop NQFs in the U.S. have not succeeded in the past. What will be different this time?
Yes. And those were efforts that had pretty substantial government support and industry support. And my fear is when I looked at the list of stakeholders involved that there isn't sufficient diversity in the stakeholders to support this kind of effort. And I am not anti NQF. I support NQFs, but we've not had good luck with this in the US, especially because the strength of our professional certification and licensing bodies is stronger than in some other countries that have NQFs. So their participation in this, even though you're talking about academic degrees at this time, is quite essential.
Lenora, thank you so much for asking that question. And I have, when we started this, asked the similar questions. So, and I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing some more of those previous attempts. We're aware of the DQP that was done with the Lumina Foundation, and that is part of the basis of the USQF. We're working off of that previous research to kind of develop it further because from my understanding, the goal of the DQP was to it's a degree qualifications profile. So they were looking specifically at degree qualifications. As we all know, there's plenty of qualifications that are not degrees, that are micro-credentials or workforce learning. Where do those fit? And then also the Beta American Credentials Framework by Volker Rein. We've included him in this conversation to make sure that we are continuing the work. We're not trying to step on any toes and say that this time it's going to be successful without the previous foundation that was laid. So maybe this time it will be successful because we're trying to bring in all that previous work that has been done and to continue.
I'm very sorry. This work goes back to the 90s, it was funded by the US federal government. There were very large pilot programs involved. And I know we personally worked with the American Electronics Association for the NQF in that area, and then also the National Retail Federation was involved in the different industry. It wasn't by industry, it was by skills and competencies that were shared across different industries, that particular effort. So it was rather unique, and that may have been part of the issue, who knows, but there have been other efforts earlier than that as well, and we just have, and I'm not saying we can't, I'm just saying, I think as you already know, of course, this is a substantive effort, the likes of which most people have not had the opportunity to be involved with.
I just want to follow up on your point, Lenora. I guess just to push the question a little bit further is to ask, what it seems to me that the challenge is buy-in, is getting buy-in by the right stakeholders. So who do you think are the right stakeholders that need to be at the table to make this be successful?
That's been a significant piece of the conversation that we've had thus far. And we're trying to cast as wide a net as possible, recognizing, though, that part of the challenge in propelling something forward is if we wait to get all of the stakeholders that we think that we need around the table, it will never get done, right? And so there has to be a jumping off point. And so that's sort of where we are right now. And the other thing I would add to that, in some ways, I think the political landscape for this is better than it's ever been in the context of the US right now. We have states that are actively engaged in this effort and that are interested in a national framework of some sort. We haven't had that in the past in the same way that we have today. We have a national conversation, at least at some level, about the value of academic credentials versus non-degree types of programs and credentials that we've not had fully in the past either. And so you think you're absolutely right to say what's going to be different this time. And the short answer is we don't know if anything's going to be different at this time. But we think that the conditions are much riper at this particular point. And the other thing that's happening now, if you look especially at what's going on with the European system, where they're trying to align toward a common European framework, as we progress forward, we got 150 countries that are on board in some capacity. As the world moves to this, the US will have no choice at some point but to follow in some way, right? And the question, I think, becomes, do we want to be leaders in that regard for ourselves, or do we want to end up taking whatever the rest of the world decides is the framework or the system? And again, I don't know the answer to that, and that's trying to predict a lot of what's going to happen in the future, which I'm not great at. But we're going into it conscious of the fact that it is going to be a significant challenge, and we think the nonprofit route is a better way to go so that we can create buy-in as opposed to a more top-down approach, which we don't think works at all in the US.
I'm just going to pull another question from the chat that sort of follows on this thinking. I think Dana Dolan posted, I'm interested in understanding possible tensions between non-degree learning and university degree programs, particularly as those with high financial concerns. Is that tension seen as a high barrier? In other words, do universities support or oppose or meh these NQF efforts?
Well, I would point out that one of the contributing factors of the USQF and the framework is that it is descriptive. So it is not a regulatory framework. We're not telling anyone what is recognized or not. We're essentially just describing the landscape in the US and showing where a particular credential fits within the framework. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, or if Todd, you have something further to contribute to it.
Yeah. So what I would say is you're right to talk about the tension. It's been a part of our conversation from day one. There are, as a part of the stakeholders that are currently comprising the advisory council and the board, there's a number of folks who have backgrounds in U.S. higher education, and we're working with some state folks who are looking at state level, as primary and secondary education. Do I think that there will be tension? Yes. Do I say that universities support this or at this particular point? No. I think universities are ambivalent. And the reason that I think that universities are ambivalent is they will always value what they do as better or more important than any sort of non-degree programming. You're also at the same time going to find people who value the non-degree programming above a university degree for whatever it is, for financial reasons or for other reasons. So to Mel's point, we're trying to be descriptive here rather than saying one of these is better than the other. And what we're trying to do, hopefully, is to create a common framework that we can talk about both of these things in productive ways, as opposed to pitting them against each other.
And just to continue on that, going back to one of the challenges is, again, just the vast amount of credentials that we're dealing with. So in a conversation with the ACQF, the African Credits and Qualifications Framework, they mentioned that in South Africa, there are as little as 20,000 qualifications available currently in their country. Then you look at the report that was just put out by Credential Engine, and their data says that there are over 1 million qualifications in the United States. That's mind-boggling. That's really hard for a learner to navigate, to determine what qualification they need or want for whatever their goals are. And so it just globally, there is a massive amount of learning that needs to be reported and tracked and recognized. And I think that's hopefully where the USQF can help just show that landscape for the learners and the employers and the workforce.
And, there's another question that was posed in the chat that I think also continues this line of thinking. Samuel Schmelzer raised the question of what is the thought process behind a 9-level NQF in the US? Is this based on an existing NQF? As I know, the EQF has 8 levels and Ireland has 10. So
that was in an attempt to describe the unique educational system in the United States, and its a main focus is our professional degrees, how they are kind of in a region of their own. So, for example, a Doctor of Dental Surgery degree, it generally requires a bachelor's degree or a minimum of 3 years of study for entrance. So there are some accelerated programs where you can get in, but in general, a degree is required for that professional degree. However, it's not at the master's level because you can get a master's in dentistry. So it is trying to describe that professional level training in the United States and where it may or may not align with other countries' professional programs.
I would add that if you look at these, and we've had some folks who've done that sort of holistically, 8 to 12 seems to be sort of the framework for levels. 8 to 10 is 8 or 10 is quite common. And to Mel's point, right, like we've got this thing that a lot of other countries don't have. And how do we begin to capture that?
And also to remember that this is a draft and we are soliciting feedback. And just because it starts at 9 doesn't mean it's going to stay 9. So South Africa, I believe, started at 10 and has now switched back to 8, or vice versa. I should know this off the top of my head, but I apologize, I don't. But that is one of the characteristics of the educational systems, is they are fluid and they are changing. And that's what we're trying to ensure, that we have a NQF that accurately describes the education currently, but also creates space and leaves space for some credentials that we're not aware are coming. So for example, the micro-credentials. We, as someone coming a little bit later to the table, have the benefit of being able to use previous research and previous studies to incorporate those micro-credentials into this framework, but perhaps there's something else we haven't thought of that we need to make sure there is space on the framework to incorporate in the future.
Right. And just to follow, I know there was a couple of comments in the chat, as Holly points out, that this is true, reflecting back on what you're saying, that, there's a lot of new developments now. We have more incremental credentialing. We have a lot of different kinds of credentials that are available, to your point. And I would just add to that too. I think that there's a lot of credentials that are called different things. So there's a lot of confusion, as like also Holly noted that, credential engine estimates are very high because they are counting sort of every granular level of credential. And maybe there are some commonalities there, maybe some differences, but there is complexity there. I also want to just recognize, Annalise has a question, Annalise Goger, so just give Annalise a chance to speak.
Thanks, Michelle. I just wanted to kind of pull on one of the threads from the comments about skills-based versus degrees. And I think what I find interesting about some of this work, and then if states were to use a template for this, is that I think it could help a lot with providing the overall high-level scaffolding to make more sense of micro-credentials and skills-based, competency-based, incremental changes within a category, and eventually inform how data systems can help be, in other words, if data systems are similarly structured in terms of how to make meaning out of that data, then it will create more opportunities for interoperability across states if at a high level there are some agreed upon levels and some agreed upon types of learning. And in that sense, I think that having these definitions could help improve the way that people can have their credentials recognized for credit eventually, or made, an employer can see in one state can see someone's credential from somewhere else and make more sense of it. And to me, that's one of the biggest innovations here that we could look at that might be different from the 1990s.
Thanks so much for sharing, Annalise.
Great. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? And I do think that there's a really interesting challenge here, I think, about and potential, opportunity with the fact that there is this burgeoning kind of credentialing environment with a lot of new things going on that does require that making sense process. I wonder, just one thought that came to my mind as you were talking, thinking about this in the comparative perspective. I think that it may be fair to go out on a limb and say that the U.S. system is potentially more local than others, other countries. And so how do you factor that sort of extremely local kind of characterization of the U.S. education system in terms of making sense of different kinds of credentials? The same credential may mean something quite different, especially when we look at these emerging kinds of credentials.
And it's a conversation that we've had internally as well, Michelle, of, does the US maybe need 50 different qualification frameworks? Are we looking at a regional qualification framework within our own country where each state has their own QF, and then that plays into a regional national qualifications framework? That is something to consider and might be the solution to Lenora's question of how is this different? Like with this work happening independently, I know that I believe Indiana has passed their framework in legislation. So Colorado is trying to do the same thing. Once those frameworks are established, do we then have the mapping just within the United States from state to state? And then that becomes the global NQF that other countries can then map to as far as mobility. So when we are speaking about mobility with the NQF, we're cognizant of not just international mobility for our students going abroad or those coming that want to be placed within the US system, but we are thinking domestically, how does that mobility work? If a student wants to pivot from CTE to an academic tract, is that a viable option for them, or vice versa? If they are pursuing an academic qualification and decide they want to go into the trades, are they going to get recognition for that learning? How does that look? How is that mapped? How does that work? So these are questions that we're asking internally and also looking externally for input and suggestions from others, such as the NCRN.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of activity going on in the States right now, so that certainly makes a lot of sense. So.
And again, we're aware of so many complementary initiatives that are happening, but we also understand there are probably ones we're not aware of, which is why we really appreciate opportunities like this to come and speak and to learn about what else is happening and what changes to the educational ecosystem are occurring, so that, again, we can contribute to those and we can work together to really benefit the learners in our country, to make sure that their qualifications are being recognized and that they are given as many opportunities and pathways as possible.
Great. Well, I think we're just about at the end of our time together, unless anyone has any final parting words, Todd or Melissa, or.
I just saw a question come in from Dana. Dana, I would say that the 3 states that are leading this discussion right now: Indiana, Colorado, Alabama.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, we will certainly have some follow-up from this. We'll be sharing out the recording and slides. I assume, Todd and Melissa, that's all right to share out with the network.
Sure.
I'm sure this is probably not the last we're going to hear this conversation. So we're just really grateful for you to share this work and help, inform us of what's going on. So thanks everybody for being here, and I look forward to seeing everybody else again next month on our next webinar. Take care. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.